So I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for their invitation and to acknowledge their dogged persistence in seeing it through in the face of war and pestilence. I'd also like to thank Nili for stepping up and doing her paper before mine. Sorry for having accidentally unplugged my computer, which ran out of power. My goal in this talk is to highlight theoretical pitfalls in diachronic linguistic research and to call for a redoubling of efforts in applying known methodological strictures and exercising a judicious helping of nuance. I begin with a cautionary tale based on some potential missteps in my own research. More than once in the last few years, I have, whether in written or oral form, treated the issue of terem katal. Many of you will be familiar with the problem. In the MT, terem yiktol is the standard expression no matter the tense aspect of the phrase. For present, future, or past habitual meaning, the use of yiktol after terem requires no explanation, since these semantic values are characteristic of yiktol. For non-habitual past events, conversely, terem yiktol is not the obvious choice, especially as it involves long, not short, yiktol. But it is plausibly explained in light of yiktol's use for conveying temporal posteriority, which is to say relative future. Thus, in Genesis 19:4, terem yishkavu ve'anshe ha'ir anshe sdom nasabu al habayit. Terem yishkavu, whatever its rendering in translation, often by means of a pluperfect, actually means something like before they would lie down or when they were yet to lie down. But if terem yiktol is the standard, what to make of the four exceptional biblical cases of terem katal? Before addressing this issue, it is sensible to review evidence of historical development in the formulation of this and cognate expressions. There's no case of terem, as far as I know, in Iron Age epigraphy. Tiberian late biblical Hebrew knows no case of terem followed by any verbal form. The same is true, as far as I can tell, of Tannaitic sources. The Samaritan Pentateuch matches the Masoretic text in terms of the verbal form following terem. This seems also to be the case of Dead Sea Scrolls biblical material. It's the non-biblical Dead Sea Scrolls, including a relevant case from the poem of Ben Sira in 11Q Psalms A, that furnish the most telling examples. In these texts, terem yiktol is restricted to present-future semantics, and terem katal comes in past contexts. And I show you the examples here from Qumran. These are perhaps in line with Ron Hendel's note on the disappearance of yiktol as a relative future in Second Temple Hebrew, though Ehud Cohen has pointed to the limited persistence of this semantic value in late biblical Hebrew. Significantly, Aramaic and Syriac translational material often have ketal after adla and edakela, when rendering biblical Hebrew terem yiktol in a past context. The influence of Aramaic on late forms of Hebrew seems plausible, though one must not dismiss the possibility of early tense aspect mood diversity in each of the languages after the particles in question. It's against this historical backdrop that I and others have approached the four exceptional cases of terem katal in past contexts in the Masoretic text. Here they are in canonical order. Vayhi hu terem kila ledaber, ushmuel terem yada et Adonai, beterem harim yuladu, and beterem harim hotba'u. And now we come to the cautionary part of the tale. In light of the standard biblical Hebrew terem yiktol syntagm and the relative proliferation of terem katal in Second Temple Hebrew and cognate in Aramaic material, Scholars, including the present speaker, have been inclined to reject the authenticity of the 4 exceptional terem katal structures in the MT, that is, to explain them somehow as secondary. A prime example is S.R. Driver's 1890 treatment of terem yada in 1 Samuel 3:7, which is example 11. Given the 2 cases of terem yiktol in the surrounding text, including terem yichbe in verse 3 and veterem yigale in verse 7 itself, Driver argued, to my mind plausibly, that what is vocalized as katal yada was intended to represent something along the lines of yiktol yeda, but came to be pronounced according to later convention because the standard tense aspect mood form in the construction shifted and the ambiguous consonantal form was amenable to reinterpretation. A similar but slightly different argument has been advanced for Beterem Harim Yuladu in Psalm 90 verse 2, and on it goes, employing linguistic and/or text-critical strategies to account for or explain away the terem katal forms in Genesis 24:15 and Proverbs 8:25. While this is all well and good, and may even be right, even if just partially, it seems to me that with this sort of approach, I and others may have forgotten or lost sight of something important. The evidence is such that I think we can all agree that terem yiktol dominated in classical biblical Hebrew, and that the use of terem katal expands in Second Temple Hebrew. But why do we need things to be tidier than this? I mean, it's nice when the distributional pattern is clear-cut, but what's wrong with some fuzziness? Authentic classical precursors of features eventually to become dominant in late material. The whole concept of linguistic evolution from one convention to another, while it may appear in our texts as sudden, must in reality have been gradual. Change had to have a start, and the starting point need not have been late material. Turning back to our rare cases of terem katal in biblical Hebrew, Driver may well be correct that terem yada in 1 Samuel 3:3 is a secondary realization masking original terem yeda. But it is not impossible that this and other cases are genuine forerunners of what became a more pronounced trend later on. Okay, having recounted my cautionary tale, emphasizing the importance of a nuanced conception of linguistic periodization that acknowledges the potential for authentic precursors of standard late features, now it's time to assess whether I've actually learned anything and can illustrate a sounder approach to another feature, specifically the replacement of future-oriented vekatal with non-volitional sequential veyiktol. In the realm of the future in classical biblical Hebrew prose, vekatal is typically used to denote sequential, which is to say temporally successive eventualities, whether predicted simple future or imposed agent or speaker-oriented modality, and in conditional clauses, both to begin the apodosis and for ancillary conditions in the prodosis. Veyiktol has, by contrast, more restricted use. Wishes, volatives, speaker-oriented modality, and final clauses, usually purpose clauses. Vekatal can also serve in classical biblical Hebrew for these semantics, the same semantics associated with veyiktol, but veyiktol does not generally mark mere temporal succession or agent-oriented modality or conditions or conditional results. The above uses of vekatal and veyiktol persist in most Second Temple sources, but nearly all post-exilic manifestations of Hebrew also exhibit varying degrees of the encroachment of veyiktol into the space of vekatal. Ehud Cohen has documented this in TIBERIAN late biblical Hebrew in general, and in Kohelet, more specifically, veyiktol has largely, though not totally, replaced vekatal. Certain Dead Sea Scrolls biblical texts, not just 1Q Isaiah A, also show this. And in particular, Dead Sea non-biblical texts, Vayikto for simple future or agent-oriented modality has been standardized. A prime example is the Temple Scroll. Ben Sira's genre makes its employment of Vayikto difficult to assess. Be that as it may, its use of Vayikto in some conditional clauses arguably betrays post-classical traits. A special case meriting extra attention is Samaritan Biblical Hebrew. In general, tense aspect mood form usage in Samaritan and Tiberian Biblical Hebrew is comparable, including the so-called conversive forms. That is, Tiberian Vayikto is generally paralleled by Samaritan Vayikto, and Tiberian Vekatal by Samaritan Vekatal. Regularly exceptional in this regard, however, are first Yud Kal forms. In the case of such verbs, where Tiberian has Vayikto, for example, Vayered, Samaritan resorts to Vayerad, evidently composed of simple Vav plus the Katal form. In other words, a non-conversive narrative past form, as variously attested in other late sources. A sort of symmetry obtains in the case of Samaritan first Yud Kal verbs that refer to the future. Here, against some, not all, but against some Tiberian first Yud Kal Bekatal forms, for example, Veyatsa, the Samaritan tradition has Veyiktol Veyitsa. While some cases of this interchange are attributable to local exegetical factors, understanding a specific form as indicating volative or final semantics, this does not account for all forms. The regularity of the Tiberian-Samaritan interchange in the case of particular first Yud Kal verbs reflects a systemic shift whereby post-classical sequential Veyiktol forms encroached into the semantic domain of Vekatal at points where the consonantal text was amenable to the shift. We now turn to the Tiberian reading tradition of classical biblical Hebrew material, where a limited degree of the Vekatal to Vayikto shift can be detected. I was sensitized to this in an article by Jan Josten. At issue here are a relatively small number of first Yud Kal verbal forms where probable Vekatal morphology has apparently been secondarily updated with Veyiktol vocalization. All involve Veyiktol forms of the verb yareh, to fear. Most, the repeated phraseology Yishme'u Veyira'u, where it is argued that the original Bekatal reading was along the lines of Yishme'u Veyar'u. And I give the examples there. There is at least a modicum of subjectivity in this assessment. Could the meaning here not be something like, they will hear so that they fear, rather than they will hear and fear? True, Veyiktol with final semantics is especially common after volitional forms, short and or clause initial jussive yiktol, imperative, cohortative, and the ex-yiktol order in the cases cited make it unlikely that the yishme'u forms that precede veyira'u are jussive. Even so, final Veyiktol sometimes follows non-volitional forms or clauses, interrogatives with agent-oriented yiktol, conditional future yiktol, simple past katal, past habitual yiktol, and even nominal clauses. One might also compare Deuteronomy 31:12 through 13, where the Yiktol Vekatal sequence of verse 12 is paralleled in verse 13 by a Vekatal infinitive construct sequence. In this pair of verses, explicit final forms, Ulema'an yilmedu in verse 12 and Le'yir'a in verse 13, are paralleled by Vekatal forms, Ve'lamdu in verse 13, and Ve'yar'u in verse 12. While Ve'yar'u is orthographically ambiguous, Ve'lamdu is unequivocally a Vekatal. The point is that even in cases where a finite form can and probably should be interpreted to have final semantics, Empty Deuteronomy is content with a vekatal, though as we shall see, the Samaritan tradition has veyira'u here. We also glean circumstantial evidence from the ancient Hebrew and foreign language textual witnesses, though given the semantic range of vekatal and orthographic ambiguity, most of their renderings cannot be considered probative regarding the identity of the form translated. The Aramaic and Syriac yiktol forms are opaque. The Vulgate reads one future and two subjunctives. The relevant biblical Dead Sea Scrolls form in 2Q11, which is parallel to Deuteronomy 17:13, is written without a mater, so it's equivocal. By contrast, the Samaritan forms, which are spelled with mater yod, are consistently and transparently yiktol according to both the written and reading components of the tradition, veyira'u, in line with the Tiberian reading tradition. But again, this is also the case at Deuteronomy 31:12, example 22, against the Tiberian tradition. The foregoing facts are subject to various interpretations. Arguably, one of the more compelling is that a form intended to be read as vekatal veyar'u was secondarily reinterpreted in the Tiberian vocalization tradition as veyiktol veyira'u, in line with trends seen to varying degrees in Second Temple Hebrew sources. This is not surprising, as various scholars have highlighted features within the Tiberian pronunciation tradition that indicate that, while preserving Iron Age features and not immune to Byzantine and medieval developments, it substantially crystallized in the Second Temple period. The obvious implication of all this is that when it comes to internal Tiberian written reading deviations such as these, the Tiberian reading tradition should be regarded as temporally removed from the pronunciation tradition implied by the consonantal text. This is borne out in numerous pieces of evidence, but it is not the whole story. Often, the Tiberian consonantal tradition itself bears witness to the very secondary features adopted more frequently in the reading tradition. Consider an example relevant to the issue under examination here. ואת העם צב לבור אתם עוברים בגבול אחיכם בני עשיו היושבים בשעיר ויראו מכם ונשמרתם מאוד. Here, the orthographically unambiguous veyiktol form veyiru is arguably less felicitous than vekatal veyaru, since the meaning is not purposive, you are crossing into their territory so that they fear you, but one of mere succession, one event leading to the next. Crucially, though, given the mater yod, the written and reading components of the Tiberian tradition are in harmony here. The same is true of the Samaritan Pentateuch. One can compare the biblical Dead Sea Scrolls text of 4Q35, which has the more ambiguous spelling without mater yod, perhaps or perhaps not, reflecting a vekatal form. If the MT form here is secondary, it shows that the yiktol morphology has penetrated into not only that layer of the reading tradition reflected in the vocalization signs, but into that reflected by the matres lectionis. Similarly, and of more immediate relevance, in a fourth occurrence of the Yishme'u ve'yira'u formula in Deuteronomy 13:12, we read, Bechol Yisrael Yishme'u ve'yira'un. This case differs from the rest in that the ve'yiktol form ends with paragogic nun. While katal forms with paragogic nun are not unknown in the Masoretic text, there are 3 of them, they are more than 100 times less frequent than yiktol forms with the same suffix. In this case, again, there is harmony between the Tiberian written and reading traditions, both reflecting veyiktol. Either the veyiktol form here with paragogic nun is original, or it has secondarily crept into the consonantal tradition. Either way, the historical depth of sequential Veyik-Tol in the Tiberian tradition clearly extends beyond the levels of vocalism reflected in Nikud and Matres, reaching to the layer of the consonantal realization. This leads us back to the three other cases of Yishme'u Veyira'u, and more broadly, to the question of whether the present scholar has learned his lesson from the cautionary tale that he recounted earlier in this lecture. If the apparently problematic Veyik-Tol readings of Veyir'u and Veyira'un are rooted in the written tradition, then perhaps cases in which Veyik-Tol Veyira'u has been seen as a secondary vocalization of Veyira'u are not deviations from the ostensible pronunciation underlying the written tradition, but reliably conserve it. I submit that there are at least three ways to interpret the evidence. One, Veyik-Tol in place of Vekatal is strictly late, in which case all supposed forms, whether in the written or reading tradition, must be explained as late. This could mean anything from the late composition of the entire surrounding text through the insertion of a late gloss, to a corruption, to the secondary updating of the consonantal text by means of addition of a mater or paragogic nun. As a default approach, I view this option as extreme. Two, on the other extreme, on the basis of the consonantal evidence of Veyik-Tol for Vekatal, one can adopt the view that all cases of suspected interchange are acceptable classical biblical Hebrew, so that no secondary process in line with late Hebrew trends need be entertained, except for the notion that such early instances are authentic forerunners in the vein of what would later become more established convention. There is also what I consider a middle path between these extremes, which I've sought to exemplify here. This involves allowing for both the early agreement of the Tiberian written and reading traditions on characteristically late features, and the deviation of the reading component from the typologically earlier profile of its written counterpart in line with Second Temple developments. Whether this is analyzed as the early original use of a characteristically late feature secondarily extended within the reading tradition, or as a process of secondary development within the written tradition, the implication is the same. Less remoteness between the written and reading components, which, even in the case of apparent secondary developments, should be seen as largely overlapping on the historical continuum. Circling back to Terem Katal, my own admittedly evolving view is that Terem Yada in 1 Samuel 3:7 is secondary for Terem Yada, and that the verb in B'terem Harim Yuladu in Psalm 90, verse 2, should be analyzed as a kal passive Yik-Tol form. By contrast, I see no reason to doubt the authenticity and early datation of the Katal forms in Genesis 24:15 and Proverbs 8:25, notwithstanding the dominance of Terem Yik-Tol, even in close proximity in the Genesis passage. Similarly, in the case of Veyik-Tol for Vekatal, I suspect that a certain number of first Yud Kal forms, vocalized as Veyik-Tol, began as Vekatal forms, so that there is a degree of dissonance on this point between the written and reading components of the Tiberian tradition. But given the consonantal testimony regarding the feature, this dissonance should not be interpreted as a chasm between the two. Obviously, linguistic continuity typifies the relationship between the written and reading traditions when it comes to the vast majority of linguistic features. But even in dissonance, there is continuity. The distinction between the written and reading components is one of degree, not essence, characterized by drift along a continuum within a continually recited tradition, rather than a clean break and restart within the tradition. It seems to me that this has ramifications for the detection of diagnostic late biblical Hebrew syntactic features, and especially for the weighing of the significance thereof. It is often the proliferation of such features that distinguishes late from early material, which means that the characterization of classical instantiations of what are normally considered late features, not to mention the periodization of the relevant surrounding material on their basis, are a delicate business. There must be a way of ensuring the exclusion of false positives. As Avi Horovitz many years ago stipulated, in light of the vagaries of literary development and scribal transmission, and given the possibility of genuine linguistic forerunners, we must exercise due caution with minority classical biblical Hebrew phenomena that eventually become characteristic of Second Temple Hebrew. His safeguard was the criterion of accumulation or concentration. In my experience, the principle retains validity, as does the application, encouraged by Horovitz and others, of thoughtful judgment, wherein nuanced balance prevails over sweeping scholarly zeal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for your fascinating paper, and I open the discussion. Please raise your hands. Professor Handel, please.
Thank you, Aaron. That was a terrific paper. I just wanted to throw in with your Genesis 24 example that Alex Raffet has very nicely argued that that whole chapter might be LBH. And in our book, Yosten and I suggested it's arguably transitional biblical Hebrew because it has early and late traits. And that we would have grouped that with one of the late traits. If it was, again, isolated, I think your caution would be warranted. But in your Hurwitz's criterion of a bunch of things, that might be more likely to be late. So I'm just throwing that point in there, but raising a question mark about one of those ideas. But it was a wonderful paper.
Yeah, so I'll just respond to 2 points. One is that my understanding of Raffet's writings is he's not too troubled by a lack of accumulation. He has other factors that he considers, non-linguistic factors that he would consider decisive. The other thing, of course, about that chapter, and I think Gary Rensburg has raised this, and that's the foreign element, the scene. Is there a reason for using non-standard features or Aramaic style features that has to do with some kind of literary factor? But I agree with you. In any case, the chapter presents non-standard features, and my inclination, of course, is to try and explain everything kind of one way, and I'm trying to bring a corrective, saying I shouldn't pull the trigger too quickly on doing that.
Emmanuel Mustay, please. Emmanuel?
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. I will also like to comment on the Genesis 24. I'm currently working on this chapter. The case of Terem Kila is one of the pieces of evidence of Alexander Raffet, as Ron Handel just mentioned. I dare say that is the only strong evidence, in my opinion, since it can't be a Masoretic vagary. The spelling doesn't allow for another reading. I think this chapter is purely classic. I address the other evidence in my paper. I attempt to show there is a massive counter evidence, but this case is the last obstacle. My way of solution regarding this case, I might have to reconsider after your talk, but I wonder if it might be the case that certain verbs are more likely to appear in the perfect tense due to their semantic value. In the case of Kila, this is obvious. The completed activities are automatically considered as belong to the past. Also in the other instance, Terem Yada, the verb Yada tends to appear in the perfect tense, since in this conjugation it denotes the state of consciousness, as in Ata Yadati, literally, now I knew, but actually it means Ani Yodea, I knew and I still know. Also the verb Sha'al, Shin Aleph Resh, appears after the adverb Od, still in the perfect tense. In 1 Samuel, it is said, Od Sha'ar HaKatan, the youngest is still left. This is the only case of a perfect form after the adverb odd in classical biblical Hebrew. So I think terem kila might have to do with the semantic value of that particular verb that attracts the perfect tense. It's just a thought.
Well, I appreciate that, especially about the verb yada and the other verb that you mentioned, sha'al. Of course, those can be old, statives or similar to statives. Terem kila, the problem is, of course, later in the chapter you've got terem achale, and so that's a difficulty. I should say I don't get the argument very well. More than one person. John Cook is one of them in his book, and then in an SBL conference one time, several think that seem to think that was significant. There's no counter example. There's nothing to compare it to. So I find it difficult. I don't find it very compelling, but people have raised the syntax of that particular phrase as well, that it starts with vayhi.
Any other questions?
Martin has one.
Okay.
Yes, thanks a lot, Aaron, for this wonderful paper. It came just to my mind that there are two places where we have terem with the imperfect and terem with the perfect in nearly identical settings. The one is Genesis 24:15. And then when the servant reiterates his experience in Genesis 24:45, he uses terem with the imperfect. And the same is in 1 Samuel chapter 3:7, where in the same sentence you have terem with perfect, and terem with the imperfect. So, and I think this supports your theory that these things were somehow left side by side, and there was no, there was no, how you say, pressure to decide for the one or the other in a sort of short-term horizon. What do you think of that?
Well, yeah. So I think I'm trying to walk in the middle of both of those. I actually tend to I tend to think that terem kila is fine, and I don't mind there being in a rather short span a difference in verb forms. I think that's okay, and this wouldn't be the only syntagm where we would see that. In the case of the Samuel passage, maybe I'm more persuaded of the possibility of a secondary kind of pronunciation there, but that might be because I'm writing a book on this kind of thing, and so I'm super sensitive to all of those right now.